Hello, my name's Jon Cooper and I'm a PhD student at Glasgow University's Centre for War Studies and Conflict Archaeology. In 2008 I wrote a dissertation in conflict archaeology with the aim of locating the lost fortifications of Haddington. The subject of the essay, well, the aim of the essay was to determine whether there are any traces of the 16th century fortifications still existing in the landscape today. It appeared that the dissertation was pretty well received, and by 2016 the document was still being used by the local council and historians to identify potential sites for archaeology surveys and basically raising the awareness of the siege within the local community. Yet it would appear to date that there has been no physical evidence of the fortifications found. The fort, once termed the Daunter of the Scots, and debatably the centre of Scotland's longest ever siege, had, as the historians state, simply disappeared entirely from view. Even Mary of Guise, now Mary of Guise was the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, even Mary of Guise herself looked at the town after the siege and declared that the English had left nothing but the plague. Was she right? Had this amazing story simply been lost without a trace and the fortifications obliterated from the landscape? In 2016, encouraged by the enthusiasm towards the dissertation, I decided to set up a group within the Haddington History Society to continue the research into the fortifications and ultimately identify the traces of the missing fort. As is the norm, every group needed a name, and therefore we came up with the Siege of Haddington Research Group, and as you can imagine, the acronym SHRG was soon adopted. The idea was to tap into the knowledge of local historians and form a group that would search the archives for any clue, any bit of evidence relating to the siege and the fortifications. So, what I would like to do in this presentation is show you what SHRG has been up to, some of the stuff that we've found out about the siege, and then talk through what we'd like to do next. So what's SHRG all about? Well, exactly, actually it's quite a small team of volunteers, and we've got a shared interest in local history and an insatiable appetite for seeking out hidden narratives and wonderfully long lost stories. Originally, the team met on a monthly basis at the John Gray Centre to mull over various books and documents and accounts and follow up on new leads. And then, when weather permitted, we would take a stroll around the locations mentioned in the accounts, trying to spot the remaining traces in the landscape relating back to the 16th century Haddington. However, it soon became evident that we were not just simply looking for physical evidence left in the landscape. There were more intangible consequences to the siege which were being revealed and leaving their mark in the local records. We spotted commentary relating to things like the fallen economy of the town, the movement of people, the names of people and places who were involved in the fighting, the effects on religion, the effects on borough politics. There was a much bigger story to tell beyond that than just the military fighting and campaign and the siege itself. Now we also soon started to look beyond the borough boundary into the wider landscape, looking at the broader social, economic and religious impacts of the siege and the rough wooing on the county. We started drawing comparisons with other Scottish boroughs and especially life along the supply routes through the Lammermuir Hills and along the coast. As you can imagine, the remit got bigger and bigger and the scope got grander and grander. We share our findings at every opportunity now. Happy to show visitors around the sites, keen to reveal our latest findings at various seminars and presentations, just like this one really. As you can imagine, COVID has put a pay to many of our regular meetings. However, it did actually spur us on to continue our research online, and over the virtual meeting platforms, our meetings became more regular, and as we met up virtually every 2 weeks, we had more time to concentrate on interpreting the written records, which we had collected over the course of the past few years. So what are we going to do with all this research? Well, our ambition is to create a virtual museum. And that's like a website that you can do anything really in a real museum, then you can actually do it in a virtual one as well. Well, that's the theory. So we will have exhibit galleries, information boards, as well as a shop, learning centres, that kind of thing. You know, everything you would find in a real life visitor centre. The highlight of the exhibition, we hope, will be a virtual model of 16th century Haddington, surrounded with the fortifications and like being attacked by the French and the Scots. That would be really something to see, we believe. So now as COVID restrictions are being lifted, we are looking ahead to share our newfound knowledge. It might be worth mentioning at this point that we're always happy to have new members come along to the History Society. So if you do have any interest in researching 16th century in, say, East Lothian, in particular the Great Siege and Siege of Haddington, then please do not hesitate and give the Society a call. No previous experience required, but just a love of history and liking a bit of detective work. So please get in touch with the Haddington History Society if you think you can help us. Okay, but enough of the recruitment drive. Let's get stuck into what we've found out. However, let's crack on with the history. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the greater history of the period, primarily because it's pretty complicated. Suffice to say, it's a heady mix of politics, religion, family squabbles, and social power play, all played out along the borders of Scotland and on the battlefields of Europe. By the time of the Great Siege of Haddington, all eyes across Europe had turned to the fighting in East Lothian, and the soldiers from Germany, Italy, Spain, France, even Albania, not to mention the French and of course the English, descended upon East Lothian for the battle. Now, it's worth mentioning we do have a number of larger-than-life characters caught up in this history. The plot primarily centres around the fate of young Mary, Queen of Scots, and the tricky problem of who is she to marry. South of the border, the ageing and ailing Henry of VIII would be very much like Mary to marry his son Edward, thereby establishing a united kingdom and promoting the Reformation north of the border. Mary's father, James V, he had died when she was very young, and the responsibility for her upbringing fell to her mother, Mary of Guise. And as you can imagine, from the Guise name, you can tell that they were very keen to marry the young Mary off to the Dauphin of France, no less, and strengthen the ties to Europe and Catholicism. The death of King Henry VIII in 1547, when Edward was still only a minor, also required a temporary leader to take charge. Edward Seymour, a man used to fighting against the Scots, took power and claiming the grand title Protector Somerset, and he was keen to carry on the intervention north of the border. However, unlike his predecessor, Somerset was not prepared to continuously come north of the border to fight a big battle, only then to have to retire back to England, as the supplies ran out. He opted for a different plan, and he wanted a permanent occupation north of the border. He would put a garrison of English troops on the very doorstep of Edinburgh. From here, he could then exert influence and power among the local lords, and persuade them by various means to back the English claims to the Union. And all he needed to do was to destroy the Scottish army and establish a permanent garrison in the aftermath of the defeat. In September 1547, he once again led an army north, meeting the Scots outside Musselburgh at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh, where he was inflicted a crushing defeat on the Scottish army. This gave him a window of opportunity to locate his garrison north of the border. His next decision was to decide where exactly to put it. So where best to place this garrison then? Well, Protector Somerset had realised that over the last few years of campaigning in Scotland, the best route for any army to take to reach Edinburgh was along the coast from the fortifications of Berwick. And basically, this would take you along the route of the modern A1 today. His plan, therefore, was to build a number of fortifications along the route, which could act as a supply dump and a place to fall back to should things get a bit dodgy. He would then choose a suitable location for the main camp. And as Haddington was in theory within one day's hard riding of Edinburgh, it seemed a perfect location to put in the garrison of armed horsemen. The English could then set about negotiating with local lords and persuading them to change their loyalty to the English across all the local area. And these assured Scots, as they became to be known, would then be happy to influence the Scottish Parliament, persuade them to take up the English ideas of the rough wooing and marrying off the Mary to Edward. Haddington had the added bonus of being located in the centre of an agricultural belt, which was known as the breadbasket of Edinburgh. And of course, by controlling the wheat, the barley, the corn, the sheep, and all the exports that would kind of go into Edinburgh, then the English could really have an influence of what the Scottish court said in the capital city. However, the English engineers sent to Haddington in April 1548 did not exactly like what they had found. First, there were no defences around the town at all. There was no castle. The only two buildings worth and able to be fortified were the Church of St. Mary's, which lay a little bit out of town to the south, and the toll booth in the heart of the town along Market Street, Marketplace area. Now, to make matters worse for the English defenders, Haddington sits in a very shallow plain, surrounded by low-lying hills, all of which were in artillery range in the 16th century. So, if the town is besieged, it would be completely exposed to artillery fire. There's only really three ways in and out of the town as well. Now, in order to get supplies into the fort, the English would have to move convoys of mules and carts and foot soldiers and stuff like that, either across the Lammermuir Hills to the south, which was really difficult going, or along the coast road, A1, through Linton Bridge, all the way from the border at Berwick. That's a pretty long route. Or the alternative was to drop the supplies off at Aberlady, put them onto ships, put them into Aberlady port, and then transport them across the wee neck of land by mule and by horse. Either way, this would pose a big logistical problem. It was not just a matter of resupplying a fortification as it was if it was on the coast, for example. And it's not really surprising when the Scots and the French did finally arrive, that they set up their camps overlooking these ways into town, effectively blocking off the town and blocking off all lines of communication for the defenders. Okay, so despite these strategic misgivings, Somerset demanded that the fort should be built at Haddington, and the English engineers decided to build the quickest and most effective fortification as they possibly could, because they really didn't know how long it would take before the French and their Scottish allies would actually make it to the town. The latest craze in fortifications was known as something called trace Italian fortresses. Now, these had been designed by the Italians to withstand the artillery and siege engines of the Turks and the Muslim empires, which were invading the eastern Mediterranean. The good news was that these new fortresses were quick and they were easy to build, and they were super effective against any forms of cannon. It was a completely new idea in Scotland, trace Italian fortresses, and Haddington was actually the first total town, to be defended by a trace Italian fort. And it was complicated, and it was a complicated combination of ditches and ramparts and embankments that not only sheltered the houses of the town on the inside from the artillery, but also provided a platform by which the English artillery could take on the Scottish guns. Now, and as trace Italian ramparts were built from earth and taken from the ditch, they dig a ditch and pile the earth up by the side of it, it meant that they were quick to construct and really easy to repair. Any cannonball fired at the embankment would either be deflected off by the angle of the embankment or fly over the town completely, or embed itself in the mud and the dirt of the embankment itself. Now, it would take an awful lot of bombardment, an awful lot of accurate bombardment, to actually create a breach in this mud earthen wall. And then even the attackers would not only have to scale through the battered ramparts, but they would also have to negotiate that massive ditch which was sitting in front of them. Now the gun platforms would ensure that every inch of wall would be covered by artillery and small arms fire. The fortress at Haddington was to be the cutting edge of technology in this particular in trades Italian fortresses. And like most new inventions, there were one or two teething problems. And the English, as it turned out, were not given enough time to complete all the fortifications that they intended to build. The English set about creating a fort around the main streets of Haddington, and the French observer described them as being almost square in plan. Had bastions at each corner, these angled platforms where you put your guns. The more substantial buildings in the town, as they were described as the necessary buildings, should be used as accommodation for the soldiers. However, those buildings deemed to be poor quality and primarily constructed from things like timber and thatch, not good when you're in a siege and would be susceptible to fire, they were taken down, they were cleared away. With little time to complete the excavations, the English tended to cut corners, excuse the pun, but they incorporated not only the existing ports of the town, but also, where they could, they incorporated buildings and walls into the new constructed defences. Precincts, especially like the Franciscan Friary along the River Tyne, they were built into the outer wall of the fortifications. The buildings and walls of these precincts were mured up. That means to say, instead of knocking them, flattening them and building an earthen rampart, all they did was pile dirt behind the existing wall, flatten it and be able to put your cannons on top of that kind of rampart, that banking. Now these were, it was a real temporary fix, but it had to do because the English simply didn't have enough time to construct. And in theory, you could carry on building this fortification as the siege progressed. So the arrival of the French began a month-long initial siege, an initial battle around the fortifications. The French and the Scots dug their trenches and saps, that's the kind of trenches heading towards the ramparts, towards the most vulnerable lengths of the English defences, primarily on the south side of the town. Now at one point, the French had mined their way to the very foot of the southwestern bastion, causing it to collapse in on itself. However, the day before they were planning to attack this breach, the Scots announced that they had come to the end of their enlistment in the army and they were heading home. Now, the Scots army, when they were recruited, were volunteers, and they normally volunteered for around about 60 days. So they had come to the end of this enlistment period and they were all heading away. Now, the French, not wanting to carry out the attack on their own, decided to postpone and then eventually cancel the whole operation. The siege then became one of a matter of starving the English into submission. The French and the Scottish camps were set up to overlook the main routeways into the town, and the English set about sending in convoys, either with reinforcements or with wagons full of equipment and extra gunpowder and food. And the idea was to try and break through the siege lines surrounding the town. However, the weather changed for the worse, as you can imagine, September, October in Scotland, and both armies settled down for a wet and cold winter in the trenches. The French themselves retired back to Edinburgh, where they were not particularly welcome. They were taking up all the hospitality in the bars, they were making a nuisance of themselves, it was costing the town a lot to have these extra mouths to feed within the city walls. Eventually, they were actually banished to Leith, of all places. They were sent to Leith and they set up their own fortifications in Leith. But that's kind of another story. But in October 1548, when this fracas in Edinburgh was at its worst, the French commanders realised they had to kind of divert attention from their men in Edinburgh. So they decided to storm the fortress of Haddington one more time. The French moved secretly at night back from Edinburgh to Haddington, and they mustered outside the St Mary's Church. And then they launched an attack called a camisade. Now, a camisade is a night attack. It's called a camisade because it comes from the French camisole, and as you can see from the picture on the right here, what the guys were doing to be able to be seen at night, they would put their night shirts or their shirts over the top of all their equipment. So then not only could they see each other in the gloom, but they could also recognize those guys as being on their side. The ruse nearly worked, and the French troops breached the outer defences of the town down in the southeast section of the fortifications. But unfortunately for them, they were met by a gunfire from a strategically placed cannon, which shot down between Church Street, between the Franciscan Friary and St. Catherine's, killed many of the French, and the French fell back to their own lines. They reckon they left up about 300 dead, basically around Church Street and the Sands and all the way back to St. Mary's. Now, this would be the closest they would ever get to storming the fortifications. The siege was then to drag on into 1549, right through the winter, and events in England and along the Scottish borders meant that not only was it even harder to get supplies into town, but also there was a lack of a political will to continue the siege. Eventually, Protector Somerset falls from grace in England and is executed, and his successor was really not keen to carry on such an expensive war north of the border. So by September 1549, plans were drawn up to relieve the garrison, and eventually the garrison was taken south again to the border, and the town was abandoned. The Scots basically let them get on with it, and then they moved into the town. Both sides had had a go at slighting the fortifications so that no other armies could use Haddington in the future. And according to the history books, when Mary of Guise visited the town after the siege, like I said, she commented on the fact that the English had left nothing but the plague, so they had flattened the place. Historians agreed that the fortifications had basically completely been wiped out. So as you can imagine, by the end of the siege, the fortifications in the town had been somewhat battered, and to make matters worse for us archaeologists, both the English and the French had a good go at filling in the ditches and levelling the walls. So where were those fortifications located? Okay, so SHRG's first job was to work out what the town looked like at the time when the English arrived. Now, the idea is that if we could see the town as the English engineers saw it, then we may be able to spot where they would have put the lines of the fortifications, the most obvious places. Although they didn't leave a map for us to look at, there's plenty more from the 16th, 17th and 18th century that reflect what Haddington looked like. Now, one thing we noticed really early on that Haddington hadn't really changed much. Especially the layout of the town seemed to be centralised around the Market Street and High Street, and you can see this unusual isosceles triangle pattern. Now this could be that after the siege, the economy of the town was a bit shaky, and there wasn't much investment in the town for a couple of hundred years afterwards. So you get this kind of preservation of the old quarter for many years in all the maps. Now, by comparing the old maps with the modern aerial photographs, like the one we've got below, it's very easy to locate where those old buildings are in the town. Well, if not the buildings themselves, the plots in which they were built on. Okay, so just by walking through the streets of Haddington and by comparing the old maps, it is possible to extract all the buildings that have been put in since the 16th century. And what we're left with is an indication as to what Haddington looked like at the time of the siege. However, as we mentioned, the English decided not to keep every house standing. They decided to incorporate the necessary houses into the heart of the fortification, and this would provide their garrison somewhere to use as barracks and facilities to keep their men fed and entertained. Now, the rest of the buildings especially those which are made of wood and thatch. They were knocked down. So where does that leave us? Well, the image on the left there is Haddington as today, and if we take away all those other buildings, those modern buildings, that leaves us with this image, which we think is a little like what Haddington must have looked like to the engineers when they arrived in 1548. Okay, so our search begins. What did the English actually build to defend that little core of houses, those necessary buildings that were left standing? Unfortunately for us, somewhat exceptionally for the period, the few plans that were drawn up of fortifications have been lost. Now these plans, or plats as they're known as, were they did actually exist, as we see them mentioned in various historical accounts, letters where people say, oh, so-and-so showed me a plan of Haddington. And we know that plans were made for other fortifications built by the English north of the border in the same years. However, the plans for Haddington seem to have simply disappeared off the face of the planet. SHRG undertook a preliminary search for the missing plans, and we contacted all the major collections and museums, not only in Scotland, but also in England and, of course, Europe, especially France and, surprisingly, Germany, asking for help to find these missing plans. Somebody somewhere must have a plan tucked away in some dusty archive, and one day we expect it to inevitably pitch up. However, until that day, we are left only speculating as to what the layout of the fortress actually looked like. If we could only find that plan, it would save us an awful lot of hard work, as you can imagine. And if you've got it in your bedroom or in the attic, please tell us. Instead, we have to turn to the written accounts and take what little evidence we can from the other primary sources. So if we don't have a plan, what do we have? Well, what we do have is a lot of written descriptions of the fortifications and the fighting that took place around it. In particular, we have a vivid description of fortifications by a guy called de Beaujeu. Now, he was on the French side in general staff, and he knew quite a lot about fortifications, and he's having been fighting in Europe for many years. Unfortunately for us, de Beaujeu took time not only to observe the fighting in detail, but also to write an account of the whole campaign. In one of his opening passages, he describes the fortifications around Haddington. It's a pretty difficult passage to read and understand. For starters, it was written originally in Old French. It's then been translated into Old Scottish and then later into English. It also meant to be read by his fellow officers, so it's written using many military terms, which would have been familiar in the day, but to our ears today may seem unusual. Let's see if I can get that up for us to look at. There you go. In particular, we have this wonderful description. You can pause the thing here to take a look at it. But also what we have are many little gobbets of information taken from many of the other accounts. And so what we've been doing within the SHRG group is to have a look at these individual comments and see if they can add a little bit more information as to the location of various other parts of the fort. One of the perhaps more obtuse references we have is, which was really worth following up, was that one of the French staff, another officer, commented in the letter that the fortifications of Haddington remind him of the fortress at Turin. Now this statement is interesting on two reasons. The first is that this officer was a seasoned veteran and obviously had been around the fortifications of Europe, and it reminds us that these armies that gathered at Haddington were international, they were professional, and they really did know their business when it came to things like siege warfare. A quick look at contemporary images of Turin reveals a fortification that does remarkably fit into that description that Beaujeu left us of the defences of Haddington. Okay, granted, Turin is a much bigger city, judging by the numbers of streets and things. However, its layout is the same, with a fort which is you can see the river around it, so it's kind of it's located in this nook of a river, very much like in Haddington. It's a square construction. It has bastions on each corner. Turin even has a base court. Now, the base court is the thing on the left-hand side, and that's usually used to house the sheep and cattle, and it's less heavily defended than perhaps the rest of the fortification. It's notable that Turin has something called a citadel, and here it's called the Cittadella. It's a star-shaped fort just on the top left-hand corner of the screen here. Now, we know that Haddington had a citadel, or was meant to have a citadel, because the comments made by the English engineers at the time describe how they were unable to build a citadel on the Nungate side of the river. And there is a commentary to say that the English were planning to build this thing, but they simply didn't have the time or the resources to be able to do it. So if we can picture Turin in our mind's eye, then we can use that as a guide to what Haddington looked like. There are other hidden clues as to what Haddington looked like. Here we've got an inset of the portrait of James Wilford. Now, so James Wilford was one of the English commanders for some of the siege, and it would appear after his death, after this portrait was commissioned, that somebody thought it'd be a good idea to commemorate perhaps his greatest military feat, which was the defence of Haddington. So they put as an inset into his portrait this little image, which they declare is Haddington Town. Now, the miniature landscape at the top right-hand corner here appears to show the west end or the west port in Haddington. In the foreground, you can just about make out a number of bodies of horsemen and pikemen and artillery units. Presumably these are the French and the Scots on the outside of the fort, the enemy. On the horizon, you can just make out to the left there the features of Trapain Law, which suggests we are actually looking at the west port of the town, and we're looking east. On the right-hand side, we can see a number of towers and spires. Now, this may represent the two tallest buildings in the town, that is to say, the St. Mary's and the Toll Booth. However, we are left wondering about the accuracy of the town wall itself, shown in the middle foreground. It would appear that the defences were far more substantial than perhaps the mud and ditch that we've been led to believe in a typical trace Italian fortification. The west port itself seems to be guarded by a massive tower, and a wall which stretches out to either side appears to be something like 20 foot high, and it's made of stone. Is this actually a complete fantasy, or is perhaps this a representation of the town as it stood at the time when the portrait was commissioned, and somebody had gone up there and taken a more recent view, which would include a town wall which may have been built by that point? And perhaps the creation, or is it a creation of the artist's imagination, and he's just getting a little bit carried away? Well, perhaps we don't know, but it is the only actual picture depicting the siege underway that we have. We also have to consider what the documentation was telling us about not only the inside of the fort, but there's plenty of more to be said about the French and the Scots on the outside who were besieging the town. Now, there is commentary about the locating of gun batteries and the digging of trenches and those saps, as we call them, those trenches that are going towards the English fortifications. Again, by plotting these onto our map, we're able to add more information as to where the fortifications were located. Well, in effect, what you're doing is saying where they're not located, because if that's where the siege works were, then we're heading towards the English lines, not necessarily on top of them. So putting all this into historical data together, this is what was proposed in 2008 in that MLIT I did. And as you can see, it looks a little bit like Turin. Let's have a look at the image. A square fortification with these sticky out bastions on either corner, with an inner set of defences surrounding the toll booth and all those necessary houses in the middle of the town there. There are locations which we did know for certain. Now, for an example, at the bottom right-hand corner there, there's a bastion, and it's called Taylor's Bastion by the English. Now, Taylor was the man who was the commander who was designated to defend that particular bastion. But the Scots named that bastion, looking from the outside in, they called it the Friary Bastion. And that's because it's located on the site of the old Franciscan Friary, which is now the Episcopal Church down in Church Street. Now, we can also suggest that the northeast bastion was located overlooking the northeast port going out of the town, which is also easily identified in today's landscape. The western bastions were probably set either side of the west port. Now, there's a debate as to how far along the Court Street the west port was at that point, but let's say it's where the west port is today, then the bastions are going to be either side of that. Perhaps the southwest bastion being as far down as the King's Meadow High School. Or primary school, I should say. Okay, so if we put our model over the reconstruction of 16th century Haddington, then that's what it looks like, with the necessary houses nestling inside that inner fortification. It looks good, and it kind of fits around that's how it fits around the reconstruction. However, SHRG has continued to review the archives. I mean, that was, what, 2008 when we came up with that idea. We've obviously thrown a lot more research into this, and our model has somewhat changed. Now, the main theory being is that when they built the latter town wall, which you can still see at the back of Tesco's car park and things like that, that was actually built upon the line of the old fortifications. Now, you can imagine that when the borough sat down in the turn of the 17th century, they said, well, you know, we want to build a new town wall. Where should we put it? Well, the ideal place would be on those abandoned humps of embankments and those filled-in ditches that were built some 50 years earlier on. The land was all open, and beyond that was fixed. So that would be the ideal place to put your town wall. So that's the theory that we have to prove through the archaeology, perhaps. I also believe that there was they made good use of natural water courses around the town. So things like the Lothburn and the Millburn had been incorporated into the defences, if not to ensure water supply, but if nothing at all. Maybe these burns, these mill runs, were actually used to feed into the ditches to be able to fill them with a little bit of water. Or maybe the burns were actually the remnants of those particular ditches. So that's what we're working on at the moment, trying to refine the model as more information becomes available. It's important to realise that the Siege of Haddington did not just leave a legacy of ditches and embankments around the town. There was a considerable impact on the lives of the people who lived in the borough. You can imagine the trauma these families went through as they discovered that their town was to be the centre of English occupation north of the border. And it's a good question to ask ourselves, what would we have done under similar circumstances? So I suppose it's like voting for Brexit or independence in a modern age. Would you prefer to align with the English, especially as they were the ones who were going to occupy the town itself, or would you align with the French and ultimately Europe, say? What would be the best for your family? Oh yeah, and of course there is that little added problem that if you made the wrong decision, you end up losing your land, your property, and possibly your life. So it was great to find evidence of these individuals who were caught up in this mayhem, our very own Humans of Haddington, you could say. So how did we go about doing that? Well, after the Great Siege, there was a reintroduction of the local authority, and the borough authority started assessing rents and imposing taxes again, so as they could get the economy going to rebuild the community. Now, these records were raised detailing how much was owned by various landlords who had property along the main streets of the town, or perhaps in the neighbouring borough. Now, one way of measuring how much rent was to be paid by the householders was to measure the frontage of the property that faced onto the King's Highway, or the main street. The more property you had facing onto the road, then the more rent you were expected to pay. So, in order to calculate who owned what, the borough commissioned a team of linemen to measure the frontage of every house and to note the occupant's name. These men simply went up and down the high street, measuring out each plot, knocking on the door and asking the name of the owner, door by door, street by street. And then they described them into a rental book, transcriptions of which you can still find today in the research library in Haddington. So that gives us a pretty impressive database listing the names of the occupants by plot along the street. Fortunately, those plots can still be seen in the main street today, as well as on 19th century maps of the town. We can therefore plot the data onto the maps and then identify their location in the modern landscape. Now, these locations were verified by looking into the notes of a guy called Martin, who had also drawn a whole bunch of sketches resulting from his research into the legal paperwork. And in this paperwork, it not only named the names of the owner of the property, but also the names of the neighbours either side of him and the extent of the land around the house. So therefore, we could identify these locations on our master plan, confirm the names of the location of the people around them, and then add the remaining names on the rental list into the houses that lay in between the known information. Simple, really, but it's taken an awful lot of time and hard work, and we're still working on it. There are still areas of the town we're not quite certain about. But many thanks has to go to Jane McKinnon for this wonderful, wonderful research. So once we know the name of the person, then we can start looking for them in various other accounts. Now, if we took a look at the old records concerning court cases and minutes of the borough records in the years after the siege, we can see how some of these plaintiffs were trying to avoid paying rent because they claimed their property was wasted. Well, that is to say, it wasn't earning any rent, it's been destroyed and is valueless, which could signify that even 4 or 5 years after the siege, the houses were still in a state of disrepair. When these houses are plotted on the map, like shown below, we find many of them were located in the area we believe took the most battering during the siege. Now, this just could be a coincidence, but on the other hand, it could be an indication as to the extent of damage in the town. And we've also gained valuable information from the same records as the land behind the properties, that is to say the rigs that extend from the street right to the end of the garden. The extent to which these extended beyond the main street can be plotted onto our map. Now, we think that most of these rigs terminated along the line of streams, burns and ditches, and were designated by a headroom. Now, that's kind of a small wall or perhaps a fence, which was built up at the end of your property. Now, this could be an indication as to where best to build our trace of Italian fortification. And we know for certain, eventually this boundary was along the path of the new town wall. So now we have a list of names of people who owned property during the 16th century in Haddington. Now the trick is now to search the archives to work out what they did during the fighting. As you can imagine, there's a lot of local families caught up in this campaign, and some of them may be your own ancestors. Certainly, if your family has roots in East Lothian and has a surname that dates back some time, then most likely your ancestors were caught up in this dilemma. However, before we jump to conclusions as to what side they may have taken in the past, probably influenced by our own knowledge of the present, then it's important to give these folk a bit of slack. We really can't imagine what it must have been like to live in East Lothian in the days of the occupation, whether the English or the French. Just imagine what would you have done if a mercenary knocked on your door in the middle of the night, asking for food and lodging and threatening to burn your house down if you did provide it for him and his men, or suddenly appeared on the doorstep of your shop in Haddington asking to billet the soldiers. A very willing to pay for your goods in your shop? What would you do to protect your family, your business, and your home? Would you take the English money and sign the assurance, or would you leave everything behind and flee to Edinburgh? Many Scots in East Lothian took the assurance, signed up to help the English, and many others had their property burnt because they didn't sign up. Now imagine what happened to the assured Scots when the French army took over the town. If we look at the court records and trials after the siege, we see a number of these people being punished and cited with the aiding and abetting the English, either through providing lodgings, trading with them, manning the ramparts of the fort, or even committing murder and raids on neighbours' property alongside the English. To tell you the truth, many of the assured Scots were later pardoned. Remember, Haddington is the breadbasket of Edinburgh, and a lot depended on these local families and their lairds to provide food for the town. It looks like, from the borough records, that many of these families that ran the borough before the siege continued to do so after the war as well. You could say they were born survivors, if nothing else. Those folk who fled to join the French and the Scottish government in Edinburgh were duly rewarded for their troubles, sometimes being given the properties of those who had actually taken the assurance. You also have to remember that these people were fairly well off. What we have not seen much of evidence is that of the poorer folk and what they got up to in the town. However, we continue to search the records for interesting stories and data on the common folk of the county. Right, so it's actually quite difficult to imagine what Haddington looked like when the English arrived on the scene. Many of the buildings in the town today look old, but they're actually more modern buildings post-siege, post-16th century. Remember, a lot of the houses were demolished in the building of the fort, and many more were damaged beyond repair and needed rebuilding after the bombardment. A good example of this, of a building completely disappearing from our modern landscape, something that was there during the time of the siege, but which is now absolutely gone, is the old toll booth. I don't know whether you know, but the old toll booth used to stand outside the Gardener's Pub on Market Street, I think it is. It survived the siege, despite being used by the English as the HQ. But it fell into disrepair in the 18th century. In fact, the only image we do have of the toll booth, or at least its spire, is an engraving by Sleasier there on the top right-hand corner. You can see the tower on the right-hand side. That is actually an image of the old toll booth and not the more modern new one. The new townhouse was built further along the road, leaving the space where the old toll booth is as a car park today. Architectural experts we've had in have carried out a number of surveys along the town, and they've found traces of 16th century buildings. They're still there, but they're hidden behind the modern facade. So if you look at the backs, if you look in the yets and the alleyways, if you look in the attics and in the cellars, there are still traces of the original 16th century build and stonework. In fact, we can also look at other towns as well to find out what a 16th century house in Scotland looked like. So if we go and compare buildings in Linlithgow, in Perth and St Andrews, we can have a reasonable understanding of what the Haddington ones looked like at the time of the siege. And of course there are certain buildings we know for certain which were also there during the siege, and that's things like St Mary's and the Nungate Bridge. They're older than the siege. But what we're unsure of is what they looked like, whether the same structure, how were they damaged, how have they been repaired subsequent to the 16th century and the rough wooing. So how do we go about recreating what these upstanding buildings look like? Okay, so whilst COVID was on and the place was nice and quiet and we could get a little bit of access, undisturbed access, SHRG asked our friends at David McCreadie 3D to see if they could get in and about the church and create a virtual model. So what the McCreadies have done, they've scanned the inside and the outside of the church, taking lots and lots and lots and lots of photographs, and they've created this virtual model of St Mary's, both inside and out. So that's every nook and cranny into the bell platform, and outside and inside into the attic roof space, and in amazing detail. It's absolutely an amazing image that we can use for deconstructing the church. Okay, so what could we do with this model? Now, as I previously mentioned, the church was outside the siege lines during the fortification. Effectively, it was sitting there in no man's land, and it took an awful lot of artillery fire and small arms fire as the guys were firing into the church or using the church as cover, using it as an observation point. And at one point, the French even put cannons on top of the tower to fire into the English defences. The English fired back to take these cannons out. So there's a lot of action, and as you can see on the modern day church, it's covered in shot holes. So what we were thinking is whether, first of all, we could plot every shot hole on the church, and with some clever jinkery pokery, we could actually track back where by the ballistic mark, the impact mark on the wall, the direction in which that shot was fired. Now, a survey like this was done some time ago, and was very successful, but it only did the first 6 foot, 9 foot of the walls going up. What we've got now is a chance to have a look at all the gunshot marks across the whole of the church, both inside and out. And I say inside because during the siege, the walls had been battered so much that it was actually possible to fire a cannonball right through the church if you got the shot right. As you can see from the image in the middle there, the damage was done, excuse me, to the tower and to the actual the nave and everything. You can see right the way through the church. So in theory, we could have shot holes on the inside of the church as well. In addition, the church, when it was abandoned, became a good place to go and stick some graffiti on. And remarkably so, we have an example of what looks like a couple of chaps on horses pulling carts, which appear to have shot holes going through the graffiti. Now think that one through. What that means is that the shot holes came after the graffiti. And there is a famous incident recorded in the accounts of the Camisard that suggests the 300 French casualties that were sustained in that particular raid were actually carted back to Edinburgh. They were put on carts which had been taken from the base court around St Catherine's Chapel in Church Street, and they were dragged out, and the corpses were put onto the carts, and the carts were dragged back to Edinburgh. And what we could be seeing here is the depiction of that withdrawal and that movement of corpses away from the church. So who could have done something like that? Well, possibly it looks like it could be some mercenaries or something like that hanging out of the church, plenty of time, feeling that they've got some time to spend, feeling pretty safe enough to be able to come up with this particular piece of graffiti. Just above it is what appears to be a gaming board. Now, if that's the case, then is that connected to the 16th century and this idea of having these guys knocking around the building? The only way we can tell is if we do a full survey looking for all the graffiti, and not only can we then identify 16th century graffiti, but then we can have a good look at all the other stuff and work out who actually inscribed their names into the walls across the centuries of the church. And finally, what we'd love to do with our model is to dismantle it brick by brick to simulate what the church looked like at the time of the siege. Now we can do that because we've got these wonderful watercolors and wonderful images of the church dating back into the 18th, 19th century, and it's just a spit then to have a look at the type of bricks that have been replaced and remove them one by one to recreate what the church looked like at the time of the siege. So that would be great too, and it would be a centerpiece piece of any display that we eventually have, perhaps in the church itself. So as you can imagine, all this new tech, all this ability to create virtual models of things, being able to reconstruct the buildings of the 16th century. Now it should be possible to eventually reconstruct every house in 16th century Haddington at the time of the siege, and wouldn't that be really good? So the aim now is to recreate a virtual reality, the whole of the town as it would have appeared as to the English as they rode in to start the construction of the fort. The theory being that if our model is good enough, we can then actually predict the best location that the English would choose to build the fort itself. In our virtual world, we could then add the fort, of course. Now, the theory being that we can then go on to do some surveys around the town, hopefully locate evidence of the walls where we predict that they will be, find the ditches, fix the locations of the fortifications, and we may have to work out that we have to adjust our model. We were wrong and the fortifications are found somewhere else. But the great thing about a virtual model is that that's pretty easy to do. So it's very flexible as we bring in more information. We could be 100% certain that our reconstruction is correct, however. So over the course of this project, which may run over years, we should be able to plug in new information. Right, so we know our aspirations might outstrip our capabilities. We are only a small group of local historians, but we're very proud of what we've done to date. And such ideas as virtual museums and AR interactive tours of the town may be a little bit beyond our skill set at the moment, but we can learn. We are talking to the experts and to the IT boffins, and they assure us that this kind of technology is available in this day and age and can work. They in turn are absolutely overwhelmed by the historic narrative of the siege and really love to take on the challenge of finding the traces of this lost trace Italian fortress. Those experts who deal with 16th century buildings, architecture, battlefield archaeology, 16th century Scottish history, all those guys reckon it won't be easy to build up a definitive account of the events. There is an awful lot to look at, but we are still looking. We are still investigating and we are still searching the archives. And the great thing about this kind of project is we are always happy to develop our research and adjust our understanding as new evidence is unearthed. It's very much a journey, this one, and not necessarily the destination that is important here. And we invite you to come along on that journey. And who knows, we may even find that missing plan of the fortress. And we haven't really started yet looking for what is actually under our very feet. So how can you help, first of all? Well, primarily you can help spread the word about the siege. Tell your friends, tell your neighbours, and if you'd like to get involved in the research, then think about joining a history society, especially the Haddington History Society in town. You can follow what's going on our group Facebook page, and I've added the link there below. And we'll post all the latest news and all the research on this site. We'll have loads of fascinating facts, and you can use those to impress your guests when they come to visit the town. Okay, we'll also put on there notifications of any tours and any presentations, any various walks and talks and stuff that you could go on concerning the siege. Now, if we can get sponsorship, we also hope to have some community digs, and we may need volunteers to help with architectural surveys and create education packs for the local schools. Actually, you may find it that your kids get to know more about the siege than you do, and they may be coming to you to teach you all about your heritage. It's a long journey ahead of us, but I hope that this presentation has not only inspired you to think about the heritage which is found along the high streets and in the yetts and the alleyways of Haddington, but also get you thinking about how we can present such a wonderful narrative to the public. Well, that's all our plans and endeavours, and we hope you found them inspirational. They said that the English left nothing but the plague in Haddington. Well, I don't believe that, and I invite you to come along and let's prove Mary of Guise totally wrong. Anyway, cheerio for now, and thank you very much for listening.